It's now 5 o'clock, so we're going to start the third and final panel, Innovation and Foresight, and I can see we've got our panelists here. So we'll kick straight off with Belen. If you want to introduce yourself and then share your screen and start your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I am Belen, and I am a PhD candidate in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University in Canada. And now I'll share my screen. Okay. Yeah. So yes, today I'm very excited to talk about the methodology that I implemented to conduct my doctoral research, which was a community-engaged research. So what is community-engaged research? According to my university, it is defined by a set of practices, values, and objectives that enable the active participation of the individual and communities directly affected by research activities. So in other words, it's a research approach that centers communities at the center of the research project, and that makes the whole project together with communities to make sure that the impact that the research has directly responds to the community's needs. So a little bit of background of this research, it is my project started with the consideration that the current understandings of health and well-being have some limitations. So for example, currently the World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And while this understanding of health has the very important contribution of considering health beyond the absence of disease, it has been challenged for some reasons. For example, some people have argued that it does not consider what health might mean in the presence of adverse or limiting factors, such as the pandemic, for example, like when the complete physical, mental, and social well-being is not possible or it is difficult to achieve, what health means in that context, in that moment. And then it has also been argued that these understandings of health are not very specific to particular contexts, and as a result, they don't necessarily respond to the needs of each specific place. So with these considerations, my project explored alternative expressions of well-being and health with 59 internal migrant women in Ecuador. And that is women who had migrated from different parts of the country to Quito, which is the capital city of this Latin American country. And this is a very interesting place to explore alternative expressions of health and well-being, because although it's very small in space, it has a lot of diversity. So there are 18 different groups and 14 different languages in Ecuador. So exploring different expressions of well-being and health in this context allow for a very diverse group of voices to converge. And the 59 women who were who participated in this project were very diverse in multiple ways. The youngest one was 19 years old, and the oldest one was 71. They came from 17 of the 24 provinces of Ecuador, and they also identified as many parts of these indigenous groups present in the country. They spoke 3 different languages, and they were they had very different occupations as well. So exploring these themes with this group was very enriching, because it allowed a lot of diverse voices to come together. And to start exploring these questions, I used 3 main methods. The first one was one-on-one interviews with participants, where we explored together what well-being might mean in their specific days and contexts. And then we had 4 gatherings with participants. 2 of them were in person and 2 were online. And during these gatherings, we tried to explore different experiences of health and well-being in the context of internal migration in Ecuador through different practice-based and arts-based methods. So for example, in this image that you can see here, it is one of the methods that we use during the gatherings. And I asked people to send me an image of something that represented well-being to them. And then through WhatsApp, Messenger. And then we created this collective online collage where we represented well-being for each one of them, and then each person was talking about what this picture represented for them. And then we used it to explore how these individual expressions of health and well-being might relate to broader structural factors shaping health and well-being of migrant women in Ecuador as a group. So using these methods, these arts-based methods, we did not use them for the artistic expression in itself, but more as a medium to address the research questions. And then together with the interviews, with the information that we got from the interviews and gatherings, we created media content together. And with this, I will explain more in detail what I meant and what this process entailed. So I approached this collective creation of media content as a practice-based approach. And with that, I mean that I addressed the research questions by engaging in the exploratory process of making this content. But I did not do this alone because as a practice, as a community-engaged research, I wanted it to be participatory. So I collaborated with all the participants in order to create this content, and also with WAMBRA, which is an online community media outlet based in Ecuador. And together we experimented with journalistic writing as a practice-based approach. And this was a different approach because usually nonfiction writing, maybe in practice-based research, is seen as separate from the practice-based methods. But in this case, I approached writing as a practice-based method in itself. So what we did is that we created this journalistic series of feature stories that was called Words That Heal. And it is a collection of 4 journalistic articles that were written in Spanish and in English, and that they explain the current understandings of health and well-being, as well as why we need different approaches and what are the suggestions and alternatives expressed by the women who participated in the project. And you can find this whole series in that link that I included in there. And this series also had graphic stories in 3 languages, in Spanish, English, and Quechua, which is one of the indigenous languages spoken in Ecuador and mostly spoken by participants as well. And these graphic stories shared the different, the main findings, the main message that we wanted to convey in a graphic way so that it could be more easily shareable. And together, I think that this journalistic series had some contributions. The first one was that it allowed to disseminate research findings beyond academia in ways that were more relevant for participants themselves, because we did it in a medium that was more available in the languages that they spoke. It also allowed us to create visible results of participants' contributions, which contributed to strengthen the relationships that we had with participants and that I created with participants, which is a very important aspect of community-engaged research. And while the final product that I just described had a lot of contributions, I think that the process in itself was very enriching in itself as well. So how it worked is that I used my background in journalism to first draft the articles because I was conscious of people's time and effort, so I didn't want to ask too much of their time. So I created the first drafts. And then I shared it with the members of the WAMBRA's team, which is the online media outlet that I mentioned that I collaborated with. And I was very excited to see that at some point, these images, how the articles looked. So it was not something that they gave me a little bit of feedback, but they actually moved and changed things around, and we created content together. And then I also shared the articles with each of the 59 participants of the study, and I asked them again for their contributions. Specifically, I asked for the contributions of their own quotes. And in order to encourage their willingness and their openness to change whatever they wanted, I said that I was approaching this the first draft that I shared with them as the raw materials that we were using to create content together. So I was really happy to see that they actually felt compelled to change things around and to write different things. And then after all of them gave me their comments, I incorporated them into a single article, and then we reviewed them again with WAMRA. And finally, we published the articles. And this process, I think, had several contributions. The first one is that it allowed us to embed dissemination throughout the research project, which is often left at the end. But in this case, it was thought of it from the beginning. So it allowed us to think how we were going to disseminate the research findings right from the start. It also allowed me to strengthen the relationships that I created with participants, because I was able to maintain a connection with them throughout time, even after the synchronous encounters of the research project had ended. And I think that also contributed to challenge the power dynamics often present in some participatory research projects, because it allowed participants and the community to be involved in every stage of the research, including data analysis and dissemination, which is not often done together with communities. It's mostly done by researchers. And these articles became an avenue for self-representation, so that people could say what they wanted to say in their own words. As Yanni Nazareno Poroso, one of the research participants in this project, said, sometimes you talk to journalists or people doing research, and then you never find out what they did with what you said, or they write things that you did not say at all. But in this case, I feel happy because I see that the words shared here truly reflect my feelings and my views. They say exactly what I wanted to say. These words are really my own. Another contribution that this process had is that it allowed us to challenge established practices, both in journalism and in research. So, for example, we experimented with narrative styles. And although it's we wrote journalistic articles which are a non-fiction writing, we used some creative narrative styles in order to make them more compelling. So we wrote all the articles in the plural voice, but we included these boxes in here that you can see in the left with the specific quotes of each of the participants. And we included an average of 3 quotes per participant throughout the series. So in this way, it allowed to create a plural story, a story written in plural, but at the same time, listen to the very diverse voices and experiences of everyone involved. In addition, we also used artistic mediums to also complement the written word. So we collaborated with Andrea Venturini, who is an awesome illustrator from the community, and she created these graphic illustrations in order to complement and go together with the words that participants shared. And in this way, we strengthened the message that we wanted to convey. This process also allowed us to reconsider different aspects from research, like authorship, anonymity, and consent. For example, we signed all the articles with a collective signature, and this is not very common in journalism, but we decided to do this because we wanted to reflect and really thank all the contribution of the people involved and all the knowledge that they shared. And this way of a collective authorship also responded in a better way, the way in which communities that I collaborated with see the production of knowledge, because they saw it as a collective endeavor, so it reflected better their views. This also allowed us to consider questions of anonymity, because although in some Western universities they encourage to produce anonymity or like focus more on anonymity, some people who participated in the project really didn't want to remain anonymous. Some did, and in that case, we respected the desire. But in some other cases, for some people, it was very important for their whole names to be known. For example, Kijari Waman, who was another research participant, say that I would never choose to use a name other than my own. Here, people see that you're wearing your traditional clothing and they automatically start calling you Maria, even when that's not your real name. In that context, Maria has a racist connotation because they don't even bother to call you by your real name with respect. They feel entitled to call you whatever they want. That's why for me, my own name is so important and it represents well-being because I am the one who decides what to be called. So in the context of Ecuador, that it has a lot of racism and discrimination, being able to choose their own names was very important with participants, and we respected that. And this also allowed me to reconsider questions of consent, because usually in research, consent is achieved at the beginning of, like before starting the research activities, but instead I approached it as an ongoing basis. So I asked at the beginning of the interviews and gatherings how people wanted to be identified, and also again when they were able to see what was gonna be written under their names. So it was an ongoing process that also contributed to enrich and sustain the relationships that we built with participants. And this process also allowed us to increase the impact and extend the community networks. We're very excited because after we published the articles, a local museum from Ecuador invited us to participate in an exhibition that they are putting together about alternative experiences and understandings of health in Ecuador. So in this way, and we're going to participate in it with print versions of the articles. So in this way, we were able to continue disseminating the research findings in ways that we had not anticipated before, and also continue to extend the community networks, as I said. Although there were these very important contributions, there were also challenges that I think that I need also to consider. The first one was the time commitment that it required. It took us a total of 9 months since I started writing the first drafts until all the articles were published. So, and this required a lot of resources that are very difficult to, to obtain, as we know. So that was something to consider. Another important aspect to keep in mind was that it required people to know how to read and write. And the people who were involved in this project all knew how to read and write, but they had different levels of comfort in doing so. So some people preferred to give me their feedback orally via voice notes in WhatsApp, and then I incorporated them in writing. But it's something to consider because it can exclude some communities and groups. It also has some linguistic boundaries that maybe other practice-based methods don't have, because it requires that everyone speaks the same language in order to be able to participate. And it also has the limitations of language itself, which other arts-based methods can express things that language can't. But still, as the way that we approach it, I think that overall it was a promising method for building and maintaining meaningful relationships with participants beyond the research project. Also working towards the active redistribution of power by situating communities at the forefront of all stages of the research process, including data analysis and dissemination of research findings, and supporting community self-representation efforts within and beyond academia in multiple ways. Yeah, and that's all. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. If you want to reach out, that's my email.
So we have a few questions in the chat for you. Let me just find them there.
Yeah.
So the first question was, did those participants decide to move forwards with their own practice or writing outside of the study and space for the project?
Yes. Yeah. So how it worked is at the beginning of the project, I told them that they could participate only in the interviews or the gatherings, or they could, when I contacted them for the first time, I asked them, like, would you be willing to be contacted again to participate in the writing? And they all said yes. But they had the option of not participating in that if they didn't want to. And they were very involved with the community media outlet as well. So they were very involved in the whole process of writing. And then they have been, they after that, they shared in their own media, in their own spaces. So I really think that they felt it was a collective process throughout the project.
Fantastic. And then the next question I've got, did any community movements spring out of this research where you were bringing these experiences and shared experience where perhaps they were not visible before?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the whole question. What was at the
I'm sorry,
beginning?
could you not hear me? Let me turn this down. Did any community movement spring out of this research where you're bringing these experiences and shared experiences where perhaps they were not visible before?
Yes, it was in Ecuador, because it's like there's a lot of discrimination and racism. The experiences of diverse women are not always heard. So a lot of them shared things that they were not had the opportunity to share in other spaces. There were not enough spaces for these kind of voices to be heard, and that's exactly what this project wanted to do. Wanted to listen to the voices that are not always heard in other media, and that's why I collaborated with community media, because in Ecuador, it is more approachable for people who do not have access or who have not given access in other types of broader media. And also, just because how Ecuador works, like it offered the space for these diverse women to converge in the gatherings, for example. So it was not just by the creation of the articles that their voices were heard, but also in the participation of the project itself. It allowed for these spaces to converge that are not very common in Ecuador.
Fantastic. And then we've got a question from Agatha asking, is the role of the community in any decision making in regards to anonymity and consent in
Yes.
terms of being anonymous and this type of research?
Yeah, super important. So yeah, each person decided how they wanted to be named. So and in the different stages of the research. So at the beginning of the interview, I told them, like, you can remain anonymous, you can choose to have a pseudonym, and you can choose your own name and last name, and whatever you feel comfortable with, that's what we will go forward with. So they knew that, and some people, and I asked that at the beginning of the interview, then again at the gatherings, and then again at the articles, because sometimes I feel that people share things, but when they see their actually what words are going to be shared under their names, maybe they will change their mind. So I wanted to make sure that people felt comfortable with what they were expressing and what they were sharing throughout the whole project. So and if they, for example, in the interview, they told me I want to use my name, and then at the end they said, no, I don't want to use my name, I want to go anonymous, I respected that. So they could change, throughout the process. And then the collective signature, it was more of a discussion. We had a discussion with everyone of how should we sign it, who should sign it, and under what name. So that's how we decided to do it. It was like a brainstorm.
And then there's a bit of a follow-up question there asking if they had changed their mind, and if so, how often would this happen?
It happened, I think, twice. It happened twice, especially with the article, with the quotes of racism, of violence, because people felt that, they didn't feel very comfortable with sharing. Everyone wanted to share, because I also told them, like, if you don't want to share this content, like, we can just move it and we choose another quote. Everyone said, no, I think it's important that it's in there. I just don't want people to know that it's me who I'm saying that. So in that case, two people decided to choose anonymity and sign it as like anonymous, and I think that one other person decided to use a pseudonym.
And then a follow-up question to the follow-up question: do you think the decision would have been different if it was decided in isolation from the community?
Yes, I think so, because sometimes, like, for example, ethics boards, like, at least here in Canada, they really emphasize the importance of anonymity. And I understand that, and I agree with it in many ways. But in the context of Ecuador, it was different, because in that quote that I read, like, for some people, it was very, very important for their names to be recognized. So, and of course, I went through the ethics boards from the university to be approved for doing this. But I think that maybe if I hadn't consulted with the community what they wanted, I would have chosen to everyone to remain anonymous. But I think that working together with the community in this way allowed for each person to choose how they wanted to be named. And I think it was more meaningful for the community in that way.
Fantastic. So I just want to invite people, if anyone does want to put their microphone or camera on to ask any questions that they maybe haven't asked in the chat, please feel free to do so for any of the presentations that you see now. There's lots of amazing comments there about the presentation, and this might be something that continues in discussions in the networking event that's available after the session as well. But thank you so much for that presentation. It was really, really insightful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the space.
And with that, we're going to move forward to let Simona introduce herself and then begin the presentation.
Hello, hi, I'm Simona. I'm from the University of York, postdoc as of recently, because I was a PhD until last month. So I'm going to share my screen. Once I do share my screen, I'm not going to be able to see this space anymore, apparently. So if anything goes wrong and you need me to stop or, thank you, or to intervene in any way, please do so using your sound, because if you send me a message, I'm not going to see it. I'm just saying because in a similar presentation, the sound went and I just kept talking for a long time. All right.
We'll let you know. We'll also let you know when you're getting towards the end of the presentation as well.
That's great. Thanks so much.
No problem.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, you should be able to see my presentation now. What I'm presenting today is the film that emerged from my practice-based PhD, which is called Stepping Through Interactive. And it's an interactive participatory film on mental health. I will explain a bit more what all of that means. My research took place at the Digital Creativity Labs at the University of York and was in collaboration with Converge, which is an organization that offers free university-level courses to people with mental health problems, involving the collaboration of university students, and it's based at York St. John University. So these are the two universities in York. Just to give you very, very quickly a bit of background about myself, I'm basically returning to academia because after my initial studies, which were mostly around film theory and documentary, I was then a filmmaker for many years. So there was quite a big gap between my initial university life and then my PhD. And the type of filmmaking that I specialized in my practice is participatory filmmaking, which I'm going to define in a moment. And my PhD was all around this form of practice. You might know already what participatory filmmaking is, but just to define it very briefly, it's a very inclusive approach where instead of having a documentary filmmaker going into a community and trying to capture that community from the perspective of the filmmaker, we act instead as facilitator. So we establish a collaboration with a community, and then we pass on skills, both technical skills, so camera work and editing, and also storytelling techniques, so that community members can create their own films where they are able to articulate their own circumstances with a minimum amount of mediation from the filmmaker, especially in terms of authorship. This is an approach that is particularly effective when we're dealing with highly stigmatized subjects and areas where groups may have been not able to represent themselves, to speak for themselves. And so if we don't allow a space for communities to create their own representations, we might risk reinforcing the stereotypes. And I have worked with this technique, especially around mental health, but also with a variety of different communities. It's based on values of voice, dialogue, transformation, encounter, trust. Sometimes it's used as a research method, but when I was working full-time as a filmmaker, we did it as an art practice, really. It wasn't applied to academia or to finding data, but it's often used also as a research method. Again, just a bit of background that participatory filmmaking is very open in the sense that there isn't really a specific workflow that we all follow. It depends a lot on which community you're working with, how much time you've got together, resources, of course, as well, and also the approach of each single filmmaker. I'm describing my approach here because it informed then how we did things in my PhD. Normally, I prefer, obviously, according also to the needs of the group, but generally I prefer to first offer some activities so that the group can explore what's important to them, what they would like to talk about. And we do a lot of brainstorming, storytelling activities without necessarily having film in mind. We also watch other films to get inspired, and then based on what the group finds important and what either personal experience or general subject they want to explore, we then break down filming in its, let's say, basic art forms. So we do some creative writing, some photography. We color over photography to reflect on the emotional impact of color. We use different music with different keywords. And then from all this creative material, the group builds a film that we then go and start to use cameras, and we bring in the technology towards the end of the process. So this is where the practice that I was coming from, especially with Converge, the organization that I was telling you about in York. We have a recurring film course where we have experimented with a lot of different approaches: video poetry, mini documentaries, comedy. Groups sometimes explore mental health because it's something that they have in common, mental experiences of mental illness, but not necessarily. They can explore any subject that they feel it's important to them and to their own self-expression. One challenge, so this is it's a fantastic form of practice in my view. There is a challenge there, that it's how to give space to everyone's authorial voice. So normally, if we make a film as a single practitioner, as a filmmaker, usually we start with lots of ideas, and then we tend to select them until we find a very narrow, or at least we strive for some cohesion there. And then we go and we develop our film. When we do films with groups in this way, there isn't really a director that decides what the creative vision is, but it should be a shared effort. People are often sharing their own personal experiences, and if we're not careful with the process of selection, dismissing one idea could sometimes mean dismissing someone's experience. So it's really important to be careful. Sometimes the groups work together very easily, and they all want to open up or share and include in the film something that works well together, but other times their view can differ. And it's at times a challenge to make space into a film for very different perspectives, even though it's an interesting challenge that often creates very stimulating and creative results. So this is where I was coming from, and I discovered the existence of interactive film, and especially interactive documentary, which is when, instead of watching a film from start to end in a linear fashion, we have different timelines, and these different timelines interact with each other. Sometimes the viewer is given an active choice, so they can decide in which direction they want the story to go. Other times the film might adapt, personalize to the circumstances of a viewer. So for instance, if we're doing a documentary which is based on geolocation, we might know that if you're based in London, you just get to see this part of the film. While if you're based in York, for instance, you see another part which is relevant to York. Or if you want to explore life in different cities, you might see all of it. So it's a very creative and open space for experimentation. It's quite an emerging field, sometimes called IDocs when we talk about interactive documentary. And it's theorized to be practiced. Let's say that that's a lot of theory around the fact that interactive documentary can have a polyvocal potential, in the sense that it can make space for different voices to coexist. Because it creates these multiple timelines, it could be easier here for different perspective to be present in the film without necessarily making the film not coherent. And also, oftentimes, interactive documentary allows viewers to input their own content as well. So sometimes there is a structure, and then viewers can upload pictures, footage, text. So instead of having a finished film, the film is ever evolving according to the contribution of audiences. So I found that that was really interesting and quite aligned quite well with what I was doing. These are some examples of famous interactive documentaries, which I'm not going to have time to describe. But if you're interested, let me know, and I can send many examples. So coming to the PhD, what we did was trying to explore whether this narrative nonlinearity, which is typical of interactive documentary, could support participatory filmmaking, especially around mental health, where I was, the area in which I was working, an area in which is particularly important to respect everyone's perspectives, because as we know, mainstream media has often done quite a terrible job of representing people with mental health issues. So it's a very sensitive area where the unfiltered views of people with lived experience are particularly important. So the way we started working on this was by selecting a film that was already existing. So Stepping Through precedes my PhD. It's a short film that we made with a group of 5 men who have direct experience of mental health problems and who are also very active in mental health activism. They do arts of different kinds, theater, music. So they were very active already in thinking about all of these issues. And in 2016, before my PhD, we made a short film called Stepping Through, which is a video poetry film where they explore the role of isolation and community in recovery. So this film was there. Participants were happy with this film. There wasn't any specific issue. And we selected this film for the very reason that everyone was quite happy with it. We didn't want to use a case study where people were dissatisfied to begin with, because otherwise we wouldn't be sure if working on the film again was going to be motivated by wanting to explore these new narrative possibilities, or rather wanting to make an improved version of the film. So we went with something that people were already happy with. The first part of the research was deconstructing this film. So we did a lot of creative activities, including mapping exercises, brainstorming, selecting key shots from the film and writing more about them, then rearranging them in different orders. And the reason to do all this work was to explore whether there was something left unsaid in the film, something that, because of the linear film form, participants couldn't fully articulate. And what came out of this first study was that even though everyone was happy with the film, participants tended to discuss just what they knew they had in common with the rest of the group, while there were lots of personal elements that they didn't find there was enough space to articulate. What they did instead was that they inserted very subtle symbols in the film, which we analyzed, but they are so subtle that most of the audience couldn't catch them. So what emerged from this study is that the possibility of expanding the film form meant that participants could say more about their circumstances and experiences, and they created additional storylines. So motivated by this study, we moved into the big chunk of work, the biggest, which was designing and then producing an interactive version of Stepping Through. And the way we did that was, especially initially, quite a challenge, because I was new to interactive film. I've never done an interactive film before, so I couldn't provide the same level of guidance as I did for traditional filming for participants. They were new, not just as creators of interactive media, but also as consumers. So we didn't have much experience as viewers of interactive films. So we didn't have that kind of shared viewing experience that we have with traditional film. And also interactive documentary is very flexible at this stage. We don't have any predefined format that we could take and do in our own version. We had to really carve our own narrative structure. And we wanted to try and create a narrative structure that would really encapsulate the expressive needs of participants. We started with a physical map. So here you can see all the strips of black and white paper. Those are segments of linear film, so separate videos, and then participants arranged them in relation with each other. They added the new content in form of envelopes that had lots of little images inside. And then all of this tape is the links that exist amongst materials. Once these participants were happy with this structure, we transformed it into a digital structure. And then we started to reflect on what should we do with viewers? Should we just let them walk anywhere now that we know that we have these materials and how they're linked together? Should we just let viewers go whenever they like? Or should we instead close maybe some paths? When and where should we provide choices to viewers? This was a very long debate. And at the end, we managed to arrive to a finished product. And the finished product was then evaluated with a group of viewers, around 100 viewers, some of whom had the experience of mental health or very keen mental health awareness, and some that didn't have any specific mental health awareness. So before we go into the results of that, I'm just going to hopefully quickly describe the film for you as it was at the end. Basically, what happens in the film is that you start as a viewer by choosing a viewpoint. These are the eyes of our participants, who were 4 at the end because one of them wasn't able to join us for the production part of the film. So 4 participants, there is also the 5th included in a different way in the film, but you start by just intuitively choosing whose viewpoint you want to start the exploration from. And then you enter a part of the film which is poetry based. And so you get the viewpoint of the participants, and then the film asks you how you felt or which emotion resonated with you from that clip. And according to your emotional response, you move into a mental health theme, which could be, there were different mental health themes that were explored according to feeling. And then from there, you move to different participants and you go back and forth for a while in this kind of poetry emotional approach. When all the possible, let's say, combination of content are exhausted, you then move into the second part of the film where you get a clip that recaps your emotional journey. So this clip is going to tell you that during this journey, you felt in this and the other way. And then you can access the story of the participants that you had the most feelings in common. I hope that makes sense in English. But yeah, what I meant is that if during your exploration, you seem to have been more emotionally similar to Paul, then you can explore Paul's story. What it tells you, it basically drops the poetry and just very factually tells you his story. His experience of mental illness, his experience of recovery, why he puts certain symbols in his poetry, and it establishes a more direct conversation. And then there is a final part where the themes of the film are sort of recapped. Why they decided to create this structure was that they wanted to first establish an empathetic bond with viewers. So they wanted to be a bit more mysterious and talk more about feelings at first. And then when the empathetic bond was established, they would gradually reveal more about themselves. And they also wanted the viewers to reflect back on their own feelings, and with the assumption behind this film that we all agree with in this group that mental health, of course, affects all of us. And the basic human emotions behind the experiences of mental well-being or mental distress are often similar to all human beings. There is also the possibility of sitting back and just letting the film play and not pressing anything. If you don't press anything, the film automatically assembles itself and becomes a lot more similar to the original Stepping Through. So this is the description of the film. I hope I'm not running out of time, but just very quickly, what we did then was expanding from a linear shape of narration to, how should we define this, some kind of branching narratives that rearranges itself according to the behavior of the viewer. And equally on a representational viewpoint, we move from the binary representation of the original film, where isolation was related to mental illness, and community to well-being, which is absolutely not wrong. It's something that's very true, and it was relevant for every participant. But now we have a more diverse representation of this theme, where there are many different things to reflect on. For someone, isolation is just loneliness, but for someone, isolation can also be important for self-reflection. For someone, it's really important to have a big group of friends, while for others, it's more important to have a few very good friends, because they might feel more lonely in the wrong crowd than when they are alone. And the viewer doesn't get to see all of this. The viewer just sees what hopefully is more relevant to them, at least if they only watch once. According to their feelings, they see the part of this representation which resonate with them. When we evaluated the film, we did so with 100 viewers, of which around 60 were recruited online, and they defined themselves as people that didn't have any direct experience of mental illness, either themselves or in their close circle, or any in-depth knowledge of mental health, while the other 40, they were from either from mental health professionally or they had direct experience. And what we found really interesting was that most of the audience reacted positively, but even those that didn't like the film, what was really important for us is that the majority of viewers really understood the mental health representations and messages in the film, even when they didn't like the film. So they took part in the questionnaire, and when they were asked to recap the messages of the film, they did so correctly, even when they didn't enjoy the film, sometimes even using some of the same metaphors that our participants used, which means they received the representation, the self-representation of participants very accurately. Most viewers found that interactivity helped support the establishment of empathy and also self-reflection. And they said that without having, the question wasn't prompt. So we didn't ask, do you think interactivity was good for empathy? We just asked, what do you think of interactivity? So the fact that viewers spontaneously talk about empathy and self-reflection means that we were really happy about that, because it really means that we managed to express that. And some of the evaluation participants, they didn't like the first part. So the people that don't like the film mostly don't like the poetry aspect of the film. And sometimes they gave up before the documentary part that comes later. But that in a way reflects what participants wanted. Participants, authors, they only wanted to disclose to people that felt their emotional bond. So overall, we were really happy with this evaluation. And that's all. This kind of storytelling can be applied to many different contexts. So it would be nice to see it applied to other mental health contexts, but maybe to other communities altogether where there are other stigmatized issues to explore. If you want to see the film, it's here. It's called, the website is steppingthrough.nfshost.com. A bit strange, but it's there. Only works on Google Chrome, unfortunately, this stage. So you will have to have Google Chrome. And then when you go there, this is how it's going to look like, because this is the screen that we were using for evaluation. So you just need to insert here, when it said ID code, just any random nickname. And then you will be able to watch the film. Soon there will be a dedicated website, but for now it's still here. So yeah, I wanted to show some videos, but because it's so personalized, it makes more sense to just have a go individually. So you're very welcome to, if you like. And that's all. Let me see if I can now stop sharing.
Fantastic. I think one of the biggest questions that people were asking asking of how to get a hold of the film or to watch through it. Would it be possible for you to pop that link in the chat for us, either just after the Q&A or whenever's most convenient for you?
Let me see. I'm trying to stop sharing. Oh, okay. Yes, I managed.
Fantastic.
Yeah, sure.
So my first question would be, you mentioned that the participants felt that some specific symbolism and imagery was missed potentially by the audience. How did the interactive nature of the film help combat this?
Basically, there was just enough space and possibility to expand on those symbols. So, for instance, and by the way, what Belen said earlier about anonymity, that was very relevant, because all the images that you saw in the presentation, those are the actual participants who featured in the film. So when one of them, for instance, had half-painted face in blue, that for him has a very specific message, and it was in the region of film, but everyone thought that it was a reference to Braveheart, so no one got the reference. But actually, it was about himself, and in this film, he had a chapter about just him, where he was able to explain why the blue and what meaning it has for him. So yeah, it's just a matter of basically having more space to explore different metaphors.
Fantastic. And you mentioned towards the start of your presentation, you mentioned that during the idea generation process, there would be an opportunity to watch and share films and get inspired. Were the films selected for the group, or was it something that each individual could bring specific work to screen and share with one another?
So there was a bit of a difference there from our usual classes, where normally when we work with traditional film, let's say, I bring some short films, and then I encourage participants to propose other short films. In this case, obviously, if you ask someone, bring an interactive documentary, they're going to be, what? So we couldn't do that, but also we waited quite a long time before we started to analyze other interactive documentaries, because first we wanted to see if a need for that kind of approach was there, without necessarily wanting to reproduce an existing model. So we only started to watch interactive documentaries not at the start of the process as usual, but a bit more later on. So it was quite different than our usual practice there.
Just to ensure there's sort of there's a more authentic way of telling the story rather than being too influenced by other interactive films.
Yeah, because I mean, with normal films, we all know them. We're all familiar with film, and so we can do a more of a critical approach to say what kind of genre, what kind of approach we like. Because it was such a new product, we didn't want to embark in this research just for the sake of making an interactive film. We wanted it to be motivated by an expressive intention from participants who were then engaged in a very long process. So they were really reliable and engaged participants, taking part in overall 40 workshops. So we were really happy that we had this level of commitment from them.
And then there's just some questions in the chat here, and Agata's asked, I'd love to know how the participants feel about how they were represented.
Yeah, well, part of the evaluation that we did at the end wasn't just with the external audiences, but we also did a study with the participants themselves, especially because between the last workshop when they worked at the film, and then by the time we managed to put it online, and then the pandemic in the middle, there were maybe 6 months in between. So we brought back the film, and we did 2 or 3 workshops, having participants watching the film repeatedly and then taking part in interviews. And overall, yeah, they were really enthusiastic. There weren't huge surprises there, because they were sort of in charge of the process from the beginning, especially in terms of authorship and decided how the film should look like. There was one thing, they really wanted to have a map of the entire content, and we technically, unfortunately, we didn't manage to achieve that. So we're a bit disappointed about that. It's something that I'm looking for funding to put there. But yeah, with the technical abilities that we had at the time, we unfortunately couldn't include that. But yeah, overall, they felt that the representation was authentic to their intentions.
Fantastic. And then another question here from Sharon saying, was there a split in male-female experience or responses at all?
No, even though there was, I'm assuming in the evaluation, there was flagging up of the fact that all the participants were men. So there was quite a lack of diversity there. And this was something that participants were conscious about from this beginning. For a long time, we debated whether to open up and include more participants that weren't included in the original film so that we could have more diversity. But we thought that by including new participants that had never done participatory filmmaking before, the process would have been then completely different. And so they tried to, they asked me for a chapter. So I've got a chapter in the film later on, which I thought was a fair request. And in participatory filmmaking, especially if the facilitator, it can happen that we also share our own personal experiences. And I see that as something ethical. Otherwise, we're asking participants to talk to us about lots of their very sensitive experiences of mental illness, but we don't share our own experience of mental illness or mental health. So there's something from me, and then there are contributions from a choreographer, from a woman choreographer. But yeah, in general, there was a bit of complaint, rightfully, about more diversity of age and more diversity of gender. Yeah.
And then again, I'm just going to give a moment. If anyone did want to switch their microphone on and ask any questions, just give a moment there before we wrap up. Just check this last message. Yep. Are you planning any follow-up? That's the next question.
Planning, yes. Achieving funding, not yet. So hopefully, we're planning to, so the participants would like to take this storytelling approach to other groups. And it would be really nice to have them now in charge of being facilitators. So the idea is that they would like to introduce this form of technology to other groups. There were some ideas of developing it with other communities, and especially amplifying, making more space for audiences to input their own views so that participants can have a back and forth with audiences. There are other applications in mental health that we have been proposed to explore. So, yes. Hopefully, yes.
Fantastic, and I think that's every question there. As we said, if you wouldn't mind and popping the link in the chat, I'm sure everyone would be really interested and excited to watch through. And thank you for that presentation as well.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. And then last but not least, we have Carola. I'm going to hand over to you to introduce yourself and then begin your presentation. And as with everyone else, I'll let you know as we're getting towards the end of your presentation time, should I need to.
Brilliant, fabulous. I'm just going to share my screen and make sure I've got share system audio on. And I'm going to put it on presentation mode. I'm Carola Boehm. I'm from Staffordshire University. There's, of course, here is always a strange thing nowadays in this kind of world. And I'm going to talk about, let me just put my windows in a way where I can see a bit of chat. I'm going to talk about Creative Canaries. My original title was actually longer. As a German, I have to have long titles. It seems to be something about Germans and long titles, but Creative Canaries, Arts and Culture, and what it tells us about what comes after neoliberalism. Now, I should say that most of the work is based on the work that I've done as part of a book, which is about to be published in just a few months. and I'm pleased to say that it's in green open access, so there will be 2 large chapters available that can be downloaded. But that's the context of it. We are looked at where does arts live in the academy, so the phenomena of arts and how institutions, higher education institutions, use arts to become more permeable, to allow us to connect with the outside world and connect with each other. So that's the book. And in that book, and that allows us to understand what I'm going to talk about. And I'm so pleased that I'm in this session with Simona and Belen, because you will see that there are quite a lot of commonalities that come out of that. The methodology that I used in the book is actually one based on cultural political economy framework. So it's kind of like a phenomenological process where I look at a thing, arts in academia, and I use these selectivities. So for instance, structural selectivity. So for instance, are there policies or political interventions about the structure of arts in higher education, arts degrees, for instance, at a local, regional, or national level? There's a discursive selectivity, which looks at the discourses that we have, the terms that we use, the concepts that we see in media appearing, in films appearing, for instance. Of course, it can be the source text, can be films as well. Agency is another selectivity where we look at the key agents of political or cultural leadership. So any individuals who had influenced something of this phenomena. And then, of course, technological. Has technology changed this phenomena in some kind of, or has it through technology changed society? And I'm not going to go into that, but the book is basically looking at that, adding some lenses. And in my case, I'm adding a culture 3.0 lens, and I will go into what that is, and a university 3.0 lens. But I look at the phenomena of arts and higher education and look at both the sort of educational policy as well as the cultural policy. And now I have to admit that in my abstract, I said, I'm going to look at 3 thematic discourses. And I thought, no, I'm going to simplify. I'm going to look at 2 thematic discourses, evident in cultural and educational policy. And I will focus on culture, and I will go into this culture 3.0 really, really short, and then individualism. Because I think through understanding the evolution of discourses in cultural policy, these discourse trajectories allow us to discern contemporary hidden or not so hidden power, class, race, or gender struggles. And so this is where, of course, the Canaries come in. The culture debate here can be used as a visible making potion, allowing us to transfer the solutions to more general economic, educational, social, and welfare-oriented policies. And I'm not going to go into that, but that just shows that in the book, I use that to really dig deep into what has been happening in the last 50 years in relation to that. But here in this talk, I want to rather get at it from a much more personal perspective. So this notion of culture in terms of everyday creativity and the influence into placemaking as well. And then from the individualism, I'm going to go into this tension between individualism and collectivism. So I'm going to strip it down, and hopefully I'll take you on that journey. And it was absolutely fascinating to see what comes out also of the other panel discussions in relation to that. So really, really short. Now, some people who've heard before, because it's a bit of my thing to talk about Luigi Sacco's conceptualization of Culture 3.0. So I apologize to those people, but I'm going to do it really, really short. Luigi Sacco, an Italian professor of economics, put forward a conceptualization which is based on how we as humans and society engage culturally. And Culture 1.0 is the type of cultural engagement with a key characteristic of patronage. And Culture 2.0, copyright and intellectual property, and Culture 3.0 is co-production and co-creation. So you can imagine, of course, patronage is just an image, and you almost immediately get it. You've got gatekeepers there, you've got limited audiences there, it absorbs value, so you can put on Culture 1.0 kind of events only with money made somewhere else, so that's value absorption. And of course, it doesn't just happen in the 19th or 18th century. Actually, if you think about the BBC proms, it's public patronage. So Culture 1.0 types of engagement also happen in our contemporary lives. So the Culture 1.0, Culture 2.0 is overlaid with Culture 3.0. It's not a linear historic trajectory. In Culture 2.0, if you think music industry in the UK, if you think film industry in the US, you're absolutely in the right track. And of course, in comes the digital, the augmented reality, the immersive realities in there as well. So that's sort of Culture 2.0. And that, of course, is supported by technological innovation and mass production. We know that, this notion of unlimited reproducibility, and you've got very large audiences. And actually what Sacco suggests is that specifically Europe is hung up on Culture 1.0. And what I have always said, that the UK specifically is hung up on Culture 2.0. And if you think about the current governmental industry strategy, certainly from the UK, but it might be also in other countries, it's all about putting the next Hollywood into London, or it's all about Culture 2.0. Now, that's not a wrong thing. There's a lot of value and a lot of money still to be made in relation to Culture 2.0, but I'm seeing a shift, and that shift goes to Culture 3.0, where you still have the ubiquitously available production tools, but you have this mass distribution of content without mediators, without gatekeepers, with open platforms. And you have a blurring of who's the producer and who's the consumer, who's the artist, or who the audience is. And also, when does the artwork start or when does it stop? So, the examples that I always give is Lost Carnival, which was a sort of festival, theater, dance kind of event, not even able to class it into a discipline or practice. And you were there for 2 or 3 days camping, and you were wove into a story that went over the whole 3 days. So you were part of the story. So it wasn't even quite clear, but who creates that story? The audience was part of the story. And of course, a good example for sort of technological driven kind of Culture 3.0 types of engagements are online gaming as well, where you also see that the participants or gosh, we don't want to call them consumers, but they almost produce more value than the original team which produces the game, with, getting groups together, making their own YouTube films, making posters, making their whole communities are based around that. So that's a good example of that as well. And top right, of course, a sort of nudge to the meta universe or the metaverse, that this is actually me or an avatar running, because I'm physically rowing on an indoor rowing and I've got it technically hooked up to a virtual environment. I'm a bit sort of techie like that, but it's quite fun. But it just shows that this Culture 3.0 is this blurring of active and passive participation. You've got open communities of practice, networked organization, massive shared and shareable production of content. And with that, it comes instant diffusion and circulation. And that's, of course, important because, as I mentioned, the suggestion is that Europe is hung up on Culture 1.0, and it's actually holding us back. And I'll go into why it's holding us back. And, my sort of thing is to say that, in the UK, we're hung up a bit on Culture 2.0, and that's also holding us back. But as I said, co-production, Culture 3.0, we understand that. So I'm going to now take us on a bit of a journey, because the whole gist of that, of course, is we want more creativity in our lives. And one of the reasons why Culture 3.0 is so good in terms of policy, or should be supported by creative and cultural policy, is that it can create that everyday creativity, that immersive creativity, which is all around you. And it doesn't matter where you are. It goes to the places where people are, rather than people have to come where the art is. It's very, very everyday in relation to that. And it's very participatory. It's very co-creative. It's very socially engaging. So when I was looking into creative cities, basically, for the book as well, and, as an academic does, one gets some funding and one goes to various places. And I went to Turku in Finland, which was a city of culture several years ago. And I went to Aarhus in Denmark, which also was a city of culture several years ago. And besides doing the more rigorous research and, the interviews and stuff like that, I did something very simple. I did what I called Culture 30 walks, so Culture 3.0 walks. I said to myself, if I walk for 30 minutes or 40 minutes or whatever it was, from the apartment that I stayed to the place of work where I worked every day, how much art, creativity, or cultural engagement do I have on this daily walk? And I documented it, in the modern way on Twitter, obviously, with a Twitter thread which looked at that and documented the very simple things that I encountered from, for instance, of course, here, there's a bookshop with a lot of comic books in there. And there were also some comic books created by the communities there. There was a dressmaker there made from people in Turku. There was, we see a game shop that was just down the street from me. On the other side, across the street, there was a sort of second-hand shop with a lot of ceramics in there. And of course, I had to take a picture because ceramics reminds me of Stoke-on-Trent, the potteries where we are based. And of course, movements feature a lot in Finland because movements were born there, of course. But of course, on my walk, I saw also the big theaters, the big cultural institutions, but also street art as such, and how, I get a joy of just experiencing this. And I also took note of the infrastructure. So the things that get me from one cultural place to another. So in the example of Turku, it not only had buses, it had e-bikes, it had scooters, it had ferries, it had a funicular up the hill, whatever you want, it had it. And it was all sort of organized by one public entity in order to get you around the city. And of course, it has also the traditional sort of heritage and culture organizations like a museum and public art there as well. And of course, the most typical of sort of cultural venues, the concert hall as well. And we know, of course, why this matters. And I'm taking the quote from Henley, who since several years now is the CEO of the Arts Council in England. And just a quote from him: "Sustained strategic approach to cultural investment pays big dividends in all of our lives." And he sort of goes into these three benefits. It not only heightens our way of being creative, it also is good for learning, feel good, innovation, place shaping, enterprising, reputation. So we know art is good, and there's a lot of evidence. We don't need to go through the evidence, but it's just there. And that's why Culture 3.0 is important, because by the fact that it has almost no gatekeepers, it supports diversity much more than the other types of cultural engagement. And with that, it becomes also much more scalable. And it's much more about living creatively rather than having a place and time where you engage intentionally in a creative act. So it's much more immersive as such. And with all of that comes, of course, another kind of term, which is now, especially in the UK, a key word for how we shape the future, and that is placemaking. With that, we can really drive cultural regeneration, and we can make the places that we inhabit. So it increases the connectivity to places and communities. And of course, that's why many people are using participatory methods and co-creative methods. And I've begun to basically always ask myself, not just how creative a place is, but how Culture 3.0 a place is. And I should note that I'm not saying that we should make away with Culture 1.0. We do need a deep practice that is patronized, and we do need the creative industries. I myself come actually from music technology. So we do need Culture 1.0 and Culture 2.0. But I'm just saying that we need that balance. And until recently, Culture 3.0 types of engagements were simply not funded by public funds or not invested in as much as the others. And we definitely need that because the impact is so much larger. So that's the cultural part. And I wanted now, and I will connect it into the individual versus the collective kind of part, because it also feeds into this Culture 3.0 kind of context. We probably need to acknowledge that for the last 100 years, we have increasingly focused on the individual. And I would even suggest that this is a form, it has been called a high individualism, lasting throughout what some other people have called the long 20th century. So it goes before 1900s and goes after 2000. So the long 20th century, and we can see that historically, we can see it emerging from the cult and the myth of the genius artist, think Paganini. And we also can see it in terms of the discourses on creativity, which are contextualized in a hyper-individualistic context. So we learn to be unique. We have learned to value predominantly what makes us unique rather than the stuff which makes us common with each other, that we share in things. And this value differential between individual creative processes, so for instance, the celebrity designer or the celebrity fashion designer, to collective creative processes like the community artist, has then created these negative value judgments in the past. It's changing on collective creative activities. So if we take again terms like volunteer arts movements, some popular art is perceived with of less value, community art, or even religious art forms. So there are these tensions and synergies between individualism and collectivism. And of course, my sort of contention is that in order for us to move into the future, we need to understand that tension and we need to balance it much more than we do. And one of the films that I was immensely struck by was actually a film that came out last year by Adam Curtis. And, especially the filmmakers who are based in Britain will know him probably quite well. He's actually a documentary filmmaker who's worked for a long time at the BBC as a documentary filmmaker. So he has access to the whole of the BBC repertoire. And he created the 6-part BBC documentary series that, and I quote him, tells the story of how we got to the strange days we are now experiencing, and why both those in power and we find it so difficult to move on. Now, I was going to play a bit of that, and it is on BBC iPlayer, and I will put in the link afterwards. But I sort of realized that, of course, we are actually recording, and as I'm not sure about the rights, and I know that the BBC already, takes down YouTube videos where there are any kind of right issues, I'm not going to play it. But it's basically a collage. It's almost like a Finnegan's Wake in the documentary world, a collage that through associations tells a story. And the story, and I'm going to go back to my slides, and the story, and this is a quote from him, is about how we are living through strange days. Across Britain and Europe and America, societies have become split and polarized. There's anger at the inequality and the ever-growing corruption and the widespread distrust of the elites. Into this has come the pandemic that has brutally dramatized those divisions. But despite the chaos, there is a paralysis, a sense that no one knows how to escape from this. And of course, he's sort of then exploring this paralysis and how we got to this strange place where we're completely and utterly discontent without being able to resolve the biggest problems in the history of humanity. And my take on that film is that he's continuing, and that's why I was so drawn to this film, continuing to look at these tensions between individualism and collectivism, that balance. And he actually says through the documents that he puts forward, and he's got Russia in there, he's got China in there, he's got America in there, he's got South America in there. And he explores that how the old powers in the Western world went to the extremes of individualism, to the extent that we hooked up our concept of freedom with individualism. But it came corrupted. And of course, the result is nepotism and elitism. And the East and Russia and China flirted with extreme collectivism in forms of communism. And again, it became corrupt. And the corruption then results in fascism and authoritarianism. And of course, he asked then, how do we break this paralysis? And here's a quote by him again. At its heart is the strange story of what happened when people's inner feelings got mixed up with power in the age of individualism. How the hopes and dreams and uncertainties inside people's minds met the decaying forces of old power in Britain, America, Russia, and China. What resulted was a block not just in the society, but also inside our own heads that stops us imagining anything else than this. And if I'd played that clip, there's that one moment where he says, we've created this. And if we've created this, we can uncreate this. And of course, he at the end of the whole film is this quote by Greber, the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something we make and could just as easily make different. And of course, for me, that is that notion of that we need to get a grip on balancing this focus on individual identity versus collective identity. And that, of course, then brings me back to culture 3.0 and this notion of co-production, because this conceptualization of culture 1.0 and 2.0 and culture 3.0 can also be seen as, on the one hand, having high individualism, and when high individualism comes in contact with arts and culture, that creates a type of engagement that is like culture 1.0. Then we had the cultural turn, or the creative industries turn, especially, of course, in the UK from 1997 onwards. There was a heavy emphasis on the creative industries. That's a sort of sometimes called a cultural turn. And then we have the co-creation turn. I would call that we're living now in a co-creation turn. And you can see that with the concepts that come up. So we see, for instance, attempts to understand what commissioning of artworks looks like, co-creation, co-commissioning, co-creation and commissioning. We also see, and this is another example, and some of you might recognize that if it comes up in a second, the Reddit, which appeared actually earlier in April this year, which was a complete and utter collective act. It was actually a moment in time where I'm just going to I'll leave it running and I'm going to put the sound off, where my son, my 17-year-old son, came into my room and said, "Mom, you've got to see this. This is culture 3.0. So he understood completely where I'm coming from. It's actually a gigantic canvas where every person logging in was allowed to do 1 pixel in one of 16 colors per 5 minutes, which forced everyone to collaborate. And you can see, and I'm going to go a bit further on, that over the 5 days where this was live, this was only 5 days alive, and of course it went wild. And some of you might, it might be an old head to you, but they created this amazing international collaborative, thousands and thousands of people strong collaboration. And then at that time, they switched all the pixels on white, and it slowly disappeared into the whiteness. And I think that's a really good example of co-creation, where you don't know who's the artist, who's the audience, when does it start, when does it stop, which one is the artwork? Is it everything? Is it every single one? These kinds of questions are really there. And of course, again, we see that our organizations are also tackling that, this notion of co-creation and co-ownership in culture. And the voluntary arts, which is now called Creative Lives, is a not-for-profit organization who created several manifestos around a cultural commons. What do we own as a commons? But that doesn't stop there. That's just arts and culture. And we've paved the way, as we always do. We have a long history of challenging the concept of the author. But actually, it goes beyond that. We see that, for instance, the European Union is now saying participatory management styles in museums and heritage organizations, or co-creating sort of future designs. So co-creation is a concept which comes in again and again. And here are some more examples in terms of higher education, student participation in co-creation. And I think these words matter. So the usage of words and terms and concepts point towards this fundamental shift. And I think it's away from high individualism, although we need to balance it. We still want to have a bit of, individual. And of course, we're so hooked up to it because we do associate it with freedoms. But there is a fundamental shift to balance it, to give also more priority towards collective, collaborative, and co-creative ways of doing things. And that, of course, specifically in the arts, and that's therefore is the canary in the coal mine, because we can see a culture 3.0 emerging with terms such as socially engaged practice, community arts, participatory arts, or participatory practices, cultural democracy, or everyday creativity. And now you can see why I was so pleased to be in this session with Simona and Belen, because it just fits so nicely. But I'm going to stop there, and thank you very much. And I'm going to see if I can unshare this. All right. Stop sharing.
Fantastic. That was really fascinating. Thank you. And there's lots of comments in the chats talking about how inspiring and really interesting the presentation was. So thank you so much, Carola. There's a couple of questions. The first one's from Agata and asks, how do we manage the tensions between individual and collective identities, and even more balance them?
Well, Monday I'm going to give a workshop on that, because I think, it's probably fair to say that within our creative practice, we also focused much more on individual practices. How do I as an artist work? And we need that deep practice. But we actually, as part of a European project, we looked at pedagogical innovative methods of actually for creators and creating their digital career stories. And my role was actually, are there exercises that raise awareness of that there are ways of initiating creative processes that allow us to rather think about the things that make us sharing in an experience that are more collective. And every arts practice does have examples for that. You get it in physical theater, where you move as a common entity. 5 people are supposed to move as a common entity. Or you of course get it in in music collaboration. You get it in jazz. But we tend to have not focused as much on the sharing aspect of that. And so I think there's probably, some work of us as societies, as creatives, as humanity to do to balance that and reconnect with the power of the collective and attach the concept of freedom to collective action. Because in the past, our institutions were built slightly more, certainly in the last 50 to 100 years, on individuals.
Fantastic. And I think, Agata, did you want to jump in with your question?
Oh, can you hear me, Carola?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I'm just gonna. As always, it's really lovely to hear to talk, and it's very interesting for me how you always find some kind of little niche within what you're talking about, and build new connections between things you said before. I find it really fascinating, and I guess the question I have stems from the previous presentations we've seen today, and I kind of got fixated a little bit about this idea between the tensions between individual and collective, because there were other presentations today, and you did mention it in the chat or at some point. There were lots of people talking about communities which function in a very collective way and co-create things in a very collective way. And even in a previous presentation, the first one presentation in the panel, the one by Belen, we were hearing about the community and how this idea of certain decisions are being taken collectively. And I love how you talk about Culture 3.0, how we go back to this idea of co-creation. And it made me think almost how, when we think about traditional communities working in this kind of collective co-creating, then what we are very good at here in Western academia is just really think in a very individualistic way and just really kind of create sometimes separations and also connections, but it's very difficult to not to notice this idea of how much we focus on individualism, and yet we're talking about Culture 3.0 and going back to kind of co-creation. I wonder if you could comment on that. It's more, it's not a question sensu stricto, but I just wonder if you think about this idea of how it almost goes back to, a circle goes back to square one.
Yes, it's a long movement towards individualism. It is really a long, steady movement towards it. And of course, we've built our institutions. Just think about, I can see that we also have our academic staff as well as students in this midst. Just think about how the university is structured. It's very difficult to put collaborative assessment in place or even to justify it to the quality assurance mechanism, because of course it needs to be an individual assessment. Yet we know so much that when we go out in industry, it's not about the individual, it's about teamwork. And we haven't somehow in our higher education institutions been able to collect, to really grab that, yes, individually we find solutions with that, but overall it's just predominantly individual. And of course, in your working life, that's the same as well. One of my bugbears is that we always have these performance development reviews on an individual basis. How are you performing individually? Do you meet your targets? But you go into your team and you realize that the performance and the quality of your work is so much based on your teamwork and not so much about the individual. Now, it can happen, but quite often it's teamwork. So I think we're now seeing the shift backwards because we understand that we've moved too far into that direction. And this notion of actually, we do want that collective, and we do want to work. We want to share in the creative act of making collectively as well as individually. Of course, there must be the space for the individual creative act as well, but it just needs to have a balance. And I think it's there, and we see that in the Let's Create strategy of the Arts Council in England, which is all about process and not anymore this focus on quality. We have to have excellent quality of artwork, which points towards culture 1.0. When it focuses on the process, it focuses then rather on the benefits that this type of cultural engagement, like Culture 3.0, can have.
Although I think you touched upon something really important, because you've mentioned things like, for example, assessments, speaking about university. And I think it's more than that. I think it's pretty much anything we do, we take personal responsibility for the tasks we're being assigned. And even if we work collaboratively on something, then you are responsible for your part, if you like. And it kind of, I think the infrastructure of our society almost forces us to still remain within this kind of separated silos. And I really look forward to kind of collectively to kind of go more towards this culture 3.0 in relation to
and we're seeing it here.
Sorry.
We're seeing it here. You know, we had two presentations.
I know. But I'm not trying to sound negative in any possible way. I'm just seeing there's still some obstacles which are more institutional. I'm not talking specifically about academia, but any kind of thing you do. And I think this is something which is rather interesting, because you're absolutely right. It's already there. We participate in this. So what we probably need to focus on is how to remove the challenges we have with that, and kind of find positive in this kind of idea of collective thinking, in a way. Something which, again, I go back to presentations we've seen today in my work, when I worked with indigenous communities in Colombia, how everything is just becoming collective, and there's no pressure for me to be the director, for you to be the OP, and for you to be a sound person. We just co-create a film or whatever other activity, and we're happy about the result as a collective, not necessarily as individuals.
Yeah, and I think in the Western world, and and I don't go into that so much, but that's why I had in the title, it's hooked up to neoliberalism. That high individualism is hooked up to neoliberalism, which then means that those countries who have bought mostly into the sort of neoliberal kind of thinking about the economy have the biggest inequalities. So when I go, for instance, to Finland, it's quite interesting, because they tend to say, oh, but you have the well-known designers, well-known fashion designers. And I say, but hang on, but you have much more everyday creativity. Whereas, yes, we have this divide between the rich, the ultra-rich creatives and everyone else. So this high individualism, this focus on the person, the leader, the one person that makes everything happen, creates a wealth differential, which is completely and utterly unhealthy. Now we know that now. I think, there is so much pushback to that nowadays, that's a force to be reckoned with, also from the creative sector. But there will be, of course, the powers, because we've created that. We've created this unevenness. There will be also in the creative sector this pushback. Now, I've already had pushback when I give this presentation, but because let's say you go to London and you have on the one hand the Royal Philharmonic Ballet there, and then a grassroots organization. If you say you have a limited amount of funding, and you say you do want to balance Culture 1.0 with Culture 3.0, one organization has to get a bit less money in order for another organization to get more. And that creates then the tensions that we have to navigate through. We do have to understand that actually, if we do manage it right, we should actually benefit all of us much better. And of course, organizations are moving into that field, but there are fears, there are concerns, and rightly so, because we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Carola.